Typhoon survivors plunder food as they await aid. This happened recently over in Bopha, the Philippines. And you may say, what does that have to do with the United States? Well, first of all, I have a lot of subscribers around the world. And the second thing is, for those of us that are in the States, it is very relevant because there are parallels and there are patterns that governments all seem to follow. And the thing is, the government agencies will often claim to be able to handle things a lot better than they actually can. And that's because they're trying to justify their existence. They're trying to justify their continued budgets. And in order to do so, they sometimes are pushed into a corner by politicians. In order to stay alive, they have to make some exaggerated claims to their skills and their abilities. I remember the Air Force promised that they would take out the entire Serbian military with an air war, an air campaign. And so they bombed and they kept count. They did BDA, photographs and everything else. And they claimed they had taken out the entire Serbian Air Force and ground forces. After the ceasefire, MiG-29s flew out of the area that was supposedly cleansed of the Serbians. And the Serbian military got in their vehicles in neat order, dress right dress, and with precise military discipline exited the area. You may say what you will about the Serbs, and they were brutal. However, at the end of the day, they certainly were not a destroyed military force. And the fact is, they had essentially, the Serbian military had used dummies, cardboard mock-ups, and very clever ones. And two, they put little cans of sterno burning inside these little cardboard mock-ups in the back. And the Air Force came over and said, look, there's a heat signature from a T-55 tank engine. And they'd fire a Hellfire missile or something else at it and destroy it and claim success. They would stretch pieces of plastic, wide pieces of thick polyplastic, across bridges, nearby bridges, about a half a mile away, and they would bomb these pieces of plastic. Meanwhile, they would camouflage the real ones. And so at the end of the day, what I'm saying is that government agencies are not as all-powerful as they would sometimes have you to believe. And you can't fault the people for doing it. The politicians kind of push them into the corner and make them make these exaggerated claims. So here's what's happened, and I'll explain that, has happened down in the Philippines. Hungry survivors of a deadly typhoon in the Philippines have raided shops and warehouses after aid deliveries were delayed. Officials monitored the desperate scenes in the aftermath of Typhoon Bopha's onslaught in the isolated southern town of Katil, a provincial official, Cedric Daip, said. The food aid took so long to arrive that the locals broke into whatever building was left standing in search of something to eat, said Daip, who was sent to the devastated South by the government to help rescue and relief operations. Before I continue, I got this off of smh.com.au. It's the Sydney Morning Herald website, and the article is an AFP from the New York Times. The typhoon killed more than 500 people and left hundreds missing across the South. About 393,000 people are said to be living in evacuation centers or receiving some other form of government assistance. You don't want to be living in an evacuation center, folks. That's where people go that don't have any preparation set in place, or their house has just been lifted off the foundations and washed away, and they've had to run away. And that's what those evacuation centers are for. People that are really the most desperate and hardest hit. Unfortunately, what we saw in Sandy was a lot of people who could have prepared didn't do so. They refused to do so. I was watching some civil defense films, and I'll be running some up here on the channel from the 60s. And back then, there was a level of preparedness that we all engaged in, and nobody said you were a kook for doing it. Now, though, it's fashionable, it's de rigueur, it's so avant-garde to put your hands on your hips and go, oh, those preppers, they're such a bunch of cretins, and laugh and scorn. And what happens is those of us that are preppers, we just dig in and keep prepping. But the rest of the people are going, wow, ooh, I don't want to look like I'm too extreme. I better not buy 4 cans of tuna fish. That looks like I'm a hoarder. Well, you know what? To heck with them, because the scorners aren't going to be there feeding you when something like this happens. And things like this happen. I don't think these people deliberately built the town of Katil in the path of a typhoon. I think that these sort of things just occur, and nobody can stop them from happening. And I love to read the haters that criticize people for living in in New Orleans, or living somewhere that there's a typhoon, or living somewhere that there's an earthquake. Well, you know what, folks? There's no perfect place on this earth to live. There's always something that's going to reach out and touch you. So before you jump into that category, you might want to just step over into the other category and say, you know what? Things are what they are, and we need to prepare. Now we're going to look at numbers here in just a second more carefully, and I'm going to tell you how the easiest way to analyze a government report is to get your calculator out. It's not that hard to figure out that something doesn't add up. Warehouses and grocery stores were broken into in Katil, a coastal town near where the eye of the typhoon made landfall on Tuesday. And guess what they were stealing? Food and water. They were hungry. Now, there are people, of course, that will opportunize, and the media usually focuses in on the guy running down the street with a big screen TV in his arms. But the fact of the matter is, when people get hungry and they get thirsty, regardless of whether you think it's right or wrong, they're going to do what they have to do to feed themselves. Nobody's going to sit at home and just starve to death and die of thirst. I know that might be convenient way for us to have to plan, but the fact of the matter is these people are going to be out there looking around for something to eat. And when you couple that with the fact that some of them have no compunction whatsoever about killing you to take what you have, it might behoove you to defend yourself and have the capabilities and the means to do so. Officials said damage to roads and bridges by floods and landslides trapped 150,000 people for 3 days in Katil and nearby towns Baganga and Boston. They said almost all buildings were flattened or unroofed. Now these people are the hardcore needing help. That's 150,000. So what's the government response? A Philippine Navy vessel with 31 tons of emergency relief and 132 volunteers, aid workers, reached Baganga on Thursday. Navy spokesman Omar Tonze said, wow, let's divide up those relief supplies, 31 tons. A ton is 2,000 pounds, correct? Let's see, am I right on that? Yes, so 31 times 2,000 is 620,000 pounds. Is that correct? 31 times 2,000 is, oh wait, I got that wrong. That's 62,000 pounds, right? Is that correct? 62,000 pounds of relief supplies showed up for 150,000 people. That's less than 2 pounds of relief supplies per person. And when you factor in that much of that's probably bottled water, you're probably looking at a meal, an MRE, and a bottle of water for everybody. Wow, thanks for the help. There are claims climate change, deforestation, poor planning, and other factors had worsened the catastrophe. Government officials said this week that storm patterns related to climate change had put communities unaccustomed to strong typhoons in Bopha's path. But they also said the destruction had been exacerbated by deforestation from illegal logging and small-scale mining, as well as poor planning and confusion created by unclear maps of vulnerable areas. The Environment Secretary, Ramon Page, said this week about 80% of the illegal logging hotspots in the Philippines are in Compostela Valley, the province that sustained the worst flooding. The denuding of mountains was seen as a factor in the landslides and flooding. Folks, I've seen that before. I saw that in Afghanistan after the president of Afghanistan, Mohammad Karzai, decided that he would make logging illegal, putting a lot of the loggers out of work up in the Cornwall. They just became smugglers, and that drove the price of the lumber up, and it made it worthwhile for them to begin smuggling and working with the Taliban, who would give them security and top cover from their competitors as they smuggled timber out of the country. And of course, when you're deforesting, you don't really care too much about replanting. What happens after you deforest is the water tables are messed up. There's nothing to hold the soil in place. The water doesn't percolate. The water washes down the valleys or washes out of the valleys and down the mountainsides and washes your topsoil into the sea, as well as taking water that should have percolated into the soil down into the water table out to the ocean as well, where it mixes with the salt water and becomes essentially useless. Last December, more than 1,200 people in the Philippines were killed by Typhoon Washi, a powerful out-of-season storm that took an unusual southern track and surprised local officials, exposing thousands of flash floods. The government vowed to crack down on risks, such as illegal settlements in flood-prone areas, to avoid a repeat of the disaster. Well, okay, where are these people going to go? A year later, Bopha took a similar southern track and sent landslides and flash floods barreling through small, vulnerable communities where thousands of people remained at the height of the storm. The government, including the president, Benigno Aquino III, had issued repeated strong warnings urging residents to prepare. Listen to that. The president urged people to prepare, but some apparently had few options. Now, what happened here with Sandy? There were people that had few options, and they were poor. And what about the rest? I remember the most telling story that came out of Sandy was a woman living in a neighborhood, a residential neighborhood, that had multi-million-dollar homes in it, and she was whining about the fact that the government had taken all of the generators down into the poor neighborhood. Why didn't they bring some over here to her neighborhood? And I thought, gosh, lady, how about you take the silver spoon out of your mouth and you drive yourself down to Lowe's before when everybody's preparing and get your own generator. How about that? Gee, what a concept. Take care of yourself. And the thing is, many of us here, we don't live in multi-million-dollar homes, and yet we're preparing. And so we look at that and we think, wow, you got no right to complain. Now, some people, they couldn't help it. Their house was prepared and the house got completely destroyed. Okay, that's why we have the relief agencies. It's to help those people. It's not to help the people that are too lazy to be bothered, or worse, they are too afraid to be seen as a hoarder. They're so concerned about their little personal image, and they're actually, some of them are scoffers. And if you're in the camp of people that laugh at folks that prepare, you're not going to be willing to prepare. You're going to go down there and you're going to say, you know what, I know I should buy water and I should buy food, but yeah, I've already kind of said that people that do that are hoarders and they're kooks. So I don't want to do that because people might see me doing it. And so you essentially paint yourself into a corner. And what happens is when you start to wake up and realize, oops, maybe I should have prepared, by then you don't even know what to do because you've spent all your time mocking and scoffing and posting nasty little comments up on prepper websites and watching doomsday preppers and encouraging National Geographic to make us look like we're a bunch of loonies. Well, when that happens at the end of the day, you have a lot of unprepared people. And in this case, a lot of people in these areas, no doubt, would like to prepare, but they simply can't. They're too poor to do so. What's your excuse here, though? Some of us say we're too poor to prepare, and yet if you look closely at your finances, you could probably do without a few things that you've prioritized as being important. Now, I'm not saying everybody's in that category, but one of the things I used to do when I helped people prepare for Y2K was I would look at their finances with them. I'd sit down and look at their budget, and I would see things like cable TV on there, and they'd say, well, I got to have cable TV. I can't get good reception. I'd say, you know what? If you'll just unplug the TV and throw the antenna away, the IQ of every person in your family will go up by 10 points within about a month because you'll start doing things like talking to each other and reading and doing family stuff. Oh my God, what a tragedy. So that's just one thought of many. Another thing was people would have a brand new car and they're making humongous payments on it, $400 a month on some of these big trucks. And I'd say, dude, you can go out and get a really nice used diesel, sell your truck for what you got in it, and go out and buy a used diesel. No more truck payments, $400 a month for prepping, yay. Okay, so these are just some small ideas. All right, officials in New Baton, in the hardest hit area, reported some evacuation centers that were supposed to provide refuge had flooded during the storm. Sounds a lot like Katrina, doesn't it? You have to prepare for the eventuality of this, that there may not be an evacuation center to go to. In fact, many people have these ideas. They're just going to bug out and they're going to go somewhere. And that's fine if the disaster is localized and small, but where are you going to go if it's a big one? Eventually, all the hotels are going to be full. And the magic FEMA camp that everybody keeps talking about are set up. People have two different views. Some of them are, you're going to be marched in there and the government's going to brainwash you, take your children, convert them to Islam, and then take you out and kill you. I don't understand what the reason is to round you up, put you in the camp, and then kill you when they could just shoot you in your own front yard if that's what they wanted to do. They're not going to do that. There's a reason that FEMA camps, though, are not a place to go, and it's because they're not really prepared. You talk about squalor and overcrowding. That's exactly what you're going to see. They'll plan on 5,000 people, and 50,000 will show up. All right, folks. Hey, this has been the Maine Prepper, and I hope that this video has encouraged you from taking a real-life example, a real-world example, and analyzing it a bit, breaking it down for our purposes, and pointing out the necessity for preparing here in the United States. And if you can and you want to join in, there are out there some good international relief agencies that you can join hands with. And if you know of a few that you're using, throw that in the comments section below so that the readers can see some good places to go and make donations. Thank you very much, folks. This has been the Maine Prepper.